you're in. We're so glad that you're in one of our inaugural ones here. And again, couldn't think of a better topic for right now, amongst many though, as grants. So I super appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And without further ado, we'll go ahead with just a few housekeeping items before we really get into the meat of our topic today. So first and foremost, we are going to be recording this webinar and next week posting it to our website, BurlingtonEnglish.com. So if for any reason you have some colleagues that might be able to benefit from this webinar, some other individuals you know, feel free to point them to the Burlington website, and we'll have that up and running again next week. So that's a good thing. Watch your email. You'll be getting an email from us next week with follow-up information. And I promise you the web links or documents or anything you either see or that we reference, we'll make sure that that you get in that follow-up email. So don't worry if you happen to miss a particular web link or a particular bullet point. We'll make sure that comes to you in a email next week. And then last one, please share. Sharing is caring. So share with us your name, please, the program you're with, and the city and state you're coming in from in the chat. Let's see, I'm going to see who's the first in the pool. This is going to be so exciting. Who's the first one to jump in there in the chat and share your information? And also, speaking of the chat, we're going to have the chat and our Q&A, and we're going to save time at the end for questions and answers. We're going to have some time, and I promise you, if we don't get an opportunity to get to your specific question, I promise you that we'll take note, send it off to our wonderful panelists that we have today, and we'll make sure that we get that back to you, okay? And speaking of panelists, oh my goodness, do we have some fantastic ones. And the ones that the basic agenda that we're going to be covering today is when you're looking at grants out there, what should you do before you begin, before you actually put pen to paper or fingers to keystrokes? What should you be looking for as far as a great match for your program and what the grant funders are looking for? The content, what makes for successful content that during evaluation you get the award notice and that it sounds really perfect, that you're actually going to be able to pull this off, these great objectives that you've laid out. And then lastly, once you get that award notice, you get the funding, rubber hits the road. What are some thoughts of that lead to successful realization of what you've talked about as far as goals in the grant, and then particularly things like monitoring and technical assistance. This fantastic panel that I keep talking about that we'll hand over in just a moment. Got Cheryl Hart, Assistant Director from NASDA, National Association of State Directors of Adult Education, also formerly at the local level in Arizona, as well as for many years, State Director at the state office in Arizona. Brian Becker in Bowling Green, Kentucky, who I met when he was heading up as a local adult educator director there in Bowling Green, and now works with the Title I side with the local workforce board, Vice President of Operations and Special Projects. And then somebody near and dear to my heart, somebody I had the honor of working with for years and years back in my home area of Naples, Florida, Collier County, Ariel Pachokas, Director of Adult Community Education for Collier County Public Schools. Once again, for anybody who's joined us late, we're recording. We'll have this for you next week. Watch an email. And again, continue please to put your name, program you're with, and contact information, city and state rather, in the chat. And again, the chat and the Q&A is what we'll use, and we'll get to those questions as towards the end of our webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to, again, that Assistant Director for the National Association of State Directors of Adult Education, Cheryl Hart.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. And as Robert said, I'm with NASDAQ right now as the assistant director. Prior to joining NASDAQ, I was the state director in Arizona for about 8.5 years. Since I came in as state director the same time as WIOA came into being. So in July of 2014. And then I've been with NASDAQ since January of 2023. So, good morning. And good afternoon. I'm actually in Long Beach, California right now. So, it's still morning here. But I wanted to give some information on grant writing from the state perspective. So, I'm going to speak to you as a former state director who did conduct numerous RF grant request for grant applications is what we called it. So it's for local providers to request the funding under WIOA, the what states have under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So under WIOA, first of all, there's some very specific requirements that have to go into the grant application. So I'm just going to go through those pretty quickly, so that like there's a lot of things that states are just required to do. They must allocate no less than 82.5% of their federal allotment to eligible local agencies. And eligible under WIOA means agencies with demonstrated effectiveness in providing adult literacy services. So it has to be, you're eligible to apply if you can demonstrate that you've effectively provided adult literacy services. So that has to be built into the grant application to determine eligibility. They must award, these grants must be multi-year contracts, so more than 1 year. So it's going to be 2 or more years. I see some 2-year contracts, 3, even 5-year contracts are sometimes conducted. And it must be competitive. So it must be a competitive process. That competitive process must be what's called direct and equitable so that all eligible providers can apply and compete. So that means things like if there needs to be a process where you can ask a question, and if that question gets answered, everyone who might be applying can have access to the answer to that question. So no special information to anybody. Everything is transparent as far as the expectations. The states must require that any provider awarded to receive funds must establish and operate programs that meet the purpose as described under WIOA. So there's a purpose there. It is to provide adult education to a target population as described under WIOA. It must address the 13 considerations that are articulated in WIOA. And I'm not going to go through all 13 of those considerations, but they are readily available online, and they should be built into a grant application. So those considerations are what will be evaluated, and there should be a rubric that aligns to those considerations that your application will be evaluated on. The awards must be used specifically for adult education services for eligible individuals as described in WIOA. And finally, the state may impose certain state-imposed requirements. So in addition to those requirements that are written into WIOA that the state must address in the grant, there may be some state requirements that are there also. But if there are state requirements, those must be identified as state requirements rather than federal requirements. And so I just want to give you some general guidance to applicants. So from the state perspective, the grant process is the state's opportunity to articulate the priorities and expectations for statewide services. So when you're addressing or applying for WIOA funds, you should be prepared to address those priorities as the state articulates in the application. And not just in the application, but through the delivery of services that if you are awarded funds. So it needs to be more than words on paper. You need to be prepared to implement what you say you're going to implement. There's recognition, there should be recognition, and there is from the state level that the local program is who is in the trenches. You are the ones that are providing the services to students. The state doesn't. The state funds providers to be in the trenches with the students. So I think it would be in your interest to have that student journey come to life in your application. So how can you describe like what's that student journey in your program as you address the application components and describe the services that you intend to provide with the funds? Looking at it from the student perspective. You should expect to see in Arizona when we did a grant competition, we always had a pre-competition meeting where anyone would come, and I always got up there and said, there are a lot of strings attached to this application. So many strings that some providers opted out. It was too many strings for them. You should expect to see a lot of strings attached to the WIOA funds you are applying for. And some examples of those strings should be transparent in the application. There shouldn't be any hidden requirements. There would be provisions and assurances outlined that you can see so you know what you are agreeing to do and the requirements you will be contracted to meet, because there will definitely be monitoring and auditing processes conducted to ensure that anyone receiving awards are actually doing what they said they would do on paper. So like I said, it's not just what you put down on paper. There will be evaluation, monitoring, and auditing of what's actually happening implementation wise. You should be able to see what kind of corrective action or out of compliance processes would be conducted if any entity does not meet the contract requirements. And then in addition, you may see some contingencies there that should funding levels change. So if there's an expectation that the state is going to be receiving this level of funding and it's a 5-year contract, that could change. And so what would that look like if there's funding changes? And just a final message. I wanted to share how NASDA, the organization, the National Association of State Directors of Adult Education, how we work to support state directors and state offices with their RFP processes. So we do this thing called Dear Colleague question. So any state director can send us a question and we pose it across the states and compile the answers. Many of those questions revolve around RFP processes, how those are conducted in states. So it's kind of a sharing of expertise. Sometimes there's questions on policies, like how are these implemented? How are they articulated in the grant contract? So we conduct those Dear Colleague questions. We also conduct a process to help states get external evaluators so that they might use a state director or state staff person from another state to help evaluate their grant applications that come in. We also do office hours twice a month, which is informal networking among state directors, and they ask each other questions about what's going on. And sometimes it's about the grant application process. I know a lot of states are in the process of doing grant applications right now. And then we are poised to facilitate an initiative called State to State Connections, and that's where we have where we work to help states network with each other in specific areas. Robert, that's pretty much what I wanted to share, and I don't know if there's any questions or anything from
So
regarding the state perspective?
if I wanted to bring out my aspiring Shakespeare as I sit down to fill out the RFP, what might you give me some advice?
I would say you would want to concisely and in a focused way address the question being asked in the grant application. Um, Usually, often there's a limit on word limit because like lengthy responses that don't directly answer the question are not really wanted. You're not going to get extra credit for having a lengthy response. It is specifically addressing the question in a concise and direct way that is actually implementable. You're going to need to implement the things you say you are going to do.
And of course, just for everybody listening, of course, you want to go to your state adult education website, of course, for full information on all of this. Can you tell us a little bit about the evaluation process and rubrics?
So the evaluation process should be somewhat transparent. The rubric should align. There should be direct alignment between the what's asked in the grant application and what is in the rubric. And so the application components should be directly in alignment. The other thing that is required under WIOA that I didn't mention, because I'm thinking it might come up later, is that there is a requirement that the workforce partners have an opportunity to review applications and provide comment on them, not evaluation of them, but comment. And those comments must be considered as part of the evaluation that's done. So part of the rubric would also have that question of alignment with workforce partners. And that is one of the 13 considerations as well. So the rubric is going to align very closely with those 13 considerations. And then, as I said, the state may have some other things built in, but those have to be identified as state requirements.
Were there
Hey,
any?
Robert,
Yeah, please jump in, Ariel.
I just talking about the rubrics. One of the things that I didn't realize when I first started writing is that if your programs were submitted or submitted for a grant application previously, one of the things I've done is I've requested those rubrics and how were we scored previously to kind of get a gauge on what areas I needed to beef up on my new grant cycle. Just throwing it out there.
And I think the state should be prepared to provide that information upon request. And I know that in Arizona, that's what we did. We had the rubrics were very transparent, and
So depending on the state, and my experience over the years too, there could be points per section. There could be points per section. Some sections.
That's a good point. Some may be weighted heavier. Yep. And so there may be some areas that are priorities for states that they are looking to develop, say, IET programs across the state or services to a population, a certain population. They may have weighted, some of the responses may have a heavier weight than others as far as points.
And for those new joining in, relatively new to adult education, just to know that the federal government created these 13 considerations with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, back in 2014, so that while each state director, like Cheryl in her past role in Arizona, each of your state directors, territory directors, are able to have some flexibility of what the RFP looks like for WIOA. In the end, for the most part, it does have to adhere to these, again, 13 considerations, such as what's your statement of need? What was your past experience? How are you going to deal with technology, leading people to unsubsidized employment, dealing with technology, professional development? And so depending on the state, these different sections might have much more weight. One area might only have 5 points assigned to it, another might have 20. And so that is one thing to consider. And then is what we keep talking about, this rubric, of course, and that's going to be in the appendices or addendums to your grant application that you can pull off your state adult education website. It's going to have, how clearly and accurately, clearly did the person address in your reply to that question. And you might get 1 point, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, depending. And the thing, Cheryl, that I think you mentioned that was very new to me years ago was that some states actually send their grant applications from their local providers maybe to other states to evaluate. That's what?
Yeah. Are they what they want? Usually what they want is to have someone on the team of evaluators. And so it would be like an application reader or something, and they would do, they would help. Yeah. And I think that often helps kind of broaden the scope of what they're looking for. The other thing that's going to be really important is that it is an equitable process, that any entity that's not previously funded still has a equitable opportunity to receive funds. So oftentimes you may see like a glossary of terms or some definitions of things that any previously funded program would already know, but it's information that would help new applicants understand what they're applying for. So,
and the last question, then we'll move on to Brian. As far as if I'm awarded the grant, can I call the state for assistance? And then also, how will the state evaluate how I'm doing once I get the application awarded?
So the state, once the awards go out, like states have various processes of how they provide technical assistance and that sort of thing. So I mentioned 82.5% must go directly to local providers. There's 12.5% is set aside for state leadership activities. So there's 12.5% of the federal allocation must be spent on providing state leadership, and those are to the funded providers. So it would be, technical assistance, professional development, training, in an ongoing way to help the providers successfully. Like the goal of the state is to provide services to students across the state. That's the goal. That's what states want to do. So I don't know of any state that isn't trying to work with their local providers to help them deliver services that are helping students. So that's kind of it's 12. I see the question in the chat. It's 12.5% right now under WIOA right now. So it's 82.5% to fund providers, 12.5% for state leadership, up to or at least 12.5%. And then that leftover 5% is the admin, what's allowed for admin. So it's up to, so the admin is a max, that 5%, the 12.5 and the 82.5 are minimums. It must be at least that. So those are the parameters for.
Great information. Thank you, Cheryl. And now we'll move to the workforce side, although Brian, of course, used to wear the local director of adult education hat. So I'll turn it over to you, Brian, and if you just briefly share again what your role is now.
Yes, all right. And yeah, good morning or late morning and afternoon, everyone. Brian Becker, I'm Vice President of Programs, Operations and Programs at the South Central Workforce Development Board. And I was a local program director for nearly 6 years in Kentucky. And I see some Kentucky colleagues have joined or introduced themselves in the chat. But so glad to see all of you guys. I have some advice about how the WIOA world works, now that I've gotten out of it from adult ed. And I'm still very much connected to it, but from the Workforce Development Board side. And I kind of got this job because I got so involved with the workforce board as an adult ed director. Our area happened to be getting reborn as an organization with the workforce services. And so I got to kind of see it get off the ground. But I'll give you some general tips too. So it won't just be about the adult ed grants that you guys may or may not be writing right now. But Robert had asked, well, what do you wish somebody had told you, as a new director or new to adult ed? And so as it relates to, WIO, I would say how Voc Rehab works. That's what we call it, vocational rehabilitation, one of the title partners. I'm still trying to kind of figure that program out 4 years into my role here, because it's so big and it provides such specialized service. But there is a question, right, that you guys will have on the adult ed grants and sometimes many other grants about how you serve individuals with disabilities. And the canned answer is, well, we'll refer them to Voc Rehab. But I think if you had a better sense of how that program worked, and we're able to talk to colleagues there, we see the data on our end, and anybody looking at the data, that the workforce participation rate for folks that have a self-disclosed disability is way behind the general population, right? For obvious reasons, and also because of the challenges that some of the jobs require that are, available in the workforce. But just better understanding, because I think I always thought, well, that's a place you can go if you never got diagnosed with a disability as a child, and they can do that, or they can do assessments, but they have a very much a work focus too. And so they're going to be not necessarily taking in people that I've ever heard that just want to know if they have a learning disability. But if they want to go to work, then they'll obviously move forward with them and do the intake. And if they're a current student of yours, they will have a lot to offer that could be supportive services there. Business services, so there should be entities in your region that are out talking to employers all the time. Sometimes those are opened up groups that you don't have to be on a workforce board staff. Very often they're volunteer driven as well. But those are people that should be maintaining contact with businesses, and know not only who's hiring and the jobs they're hiring for and the skills required, but I don't know, maybe there's people that are having conversations, or you would want them to, about how to do on-site ESL or how to do those IETs like Robert had mentioned. But the workforce investment boards do have funds, and we were able to benefit at my local program pretty early on in my time by getting a mobile GED center going. And so they actually provided the funding, the workforce board did, because we were having an issue about students being able to access the testing center. So they could pay for that, or maybe even turn on a program like that where there's a laptop cart that goes out and becomes mobile, and can, as long as it obviously meets the Pearson view. I'm only familiar with GED. I know there's other high school equivalency tests, but I put the word GED on there, but obviously they could pay for other high school equivalency tests as well, and the fees for that. And supportive services. So there might be some things that would involve transportation, childcare. Some of the grants can pay, it depends on the policies that your local workforce board has set up, and we have some that can dabble with rental assistance and things like that. So it can be very much a resource. And it has to be, just like adult is designed to be, about reducing barriers. So it can't be just because of preference that somebody's doling out checks. It has to be to reduce those barriers. But I would say, because of the 13 considerations that Cheryl had mentioned and you guys were talking about, you do have to kind of find out what your local plan is if you're writing the state adult ed grants, or contributing to that. So first thing is, do you know who your players are? Do you know who your local adult ed rep is? Do you know how to access a copy of that plan online, or be able to get a link to it? Some can be super detailed. They're all very government ease answers, or questions, I should say, and some of the way that these things are worded. But you guys will know, and I know there's instructors on the call too. Everybody's doing life-changing work. If you're doing adult ed or literacy work, you're doing life-changing work. And with grants, you just have to justify your existence for that. But you have to frame it in a very specific way, the way that these state adult ed grants work. And they want to know about how you align with the workforce board and its priorities and areas that it's going to focus on. So there's also going to be a way that you could get a lot of data to back up your claims, or to state the need that is there. Your workforce board should be able to give you access to that, or help you with that. If you yourself are not a data guru, or somebody in your organization, then they should be able to lend that support to you. But as far as the two considerations, I'll kind of pick on for a moment. The number one, the responsiveness to regional needs and individuals. I would say what I did not like and appreciate or was a struggle in adult ed was there was a ton of career pathway information out there for kids and for youth, and I never knew who was making it look nice and attractive for adults. So if there's career pathway guides out there, or whether those are printed or online, are you using them? And then are they geared for adults? Because maybe you guys can help build that with your local workforce board as well. But we tried to use a little bit of some versions that were created for high school students that were finishing up high school to make available to our adult ed students. But that was something there. So if you want to know what is the need for a career, what are the in-demand career sectors, that information should be readily accessible to you in your region. Somebody somewhere should have put that together. But your schools are probably sitting on that at the K-12 level. Again, for adults, it's kind of a struggle, but if you can get your hands on that and figure that out, that will help you a lot. Again, I mentioned this too, but if you know who your adult ed representative is, each board on their board of directors should have a local adult ed rep. And so that would be somebody to get to know as well, and should be a liaison, right? So it shouldn't just be they're representing adult ed needs. You should be hearing what the workforce board also talks about. And that information should be getting back to you. Also, if you know the Directory of Training Opportunities, I mean, you have to talk about that alignment and needs in your area. But one thing that is good to know is the success rate. A lot of training programs exist. How many of them are actually graduating people and people are getting jobs because of those? And if you've got students that you or your staff are referring to those training programs, can you quantify it? I think as much, just like in a resume, if you can talk about how you have done something and left the place better than you found it, not just what the bullet points on the job description were, but what measurable impact happened, that would be a great area to quantify. The demonstrating alignment with what your proposed activities and services are and the strategies and goals of the local plan. I think, one challenge is, can you articulate how you're supporting that? Because if you just said we got students coming in every day and they can go get their GED or they can learn English, they can improve their literacy. We've got measurable scores and TABE tests and CASAs that are proving that people are making progress. Well, the employer community does not care what CASAS is and TABE is and all of that, right? Those are just 4-letter words to them or 5-letter words. So they don't know. You've got to be able to articulate exactly how you're helping in those industry recognized programs that are in demand in your area. Another crucial thing, and it's probably happening for most of you already because WIO has been out for a long time, but if you're new to adult ed or don't understand this, you can have staff going to local centers to access the people that might be walking into those one-stops. If you've got staff going to hiring events, are you referring students to those things? Again, if you can quantify that, that should be something that somebody somewhere is quantifying. If they're set up with a table at a hiring event, if you're the director, do you have a way to know how many leads there were that day? Do you have a sign-up list and things like that? But can you quantify how many times you guys have done those kind of events? That's another key thing. And then they have things like access points, right? Where people can come to you that aren't students to access workforce services or tap into the one-stop system. So you can be a host site for that. And there's a whole, qualification process and certification process for that. But if you didn't know that your center can serve as that, that's something else that should be able to be activated. And then maybe your workforce area in the local plan has specific populations that they're serving. So I see there's some people that are from refugee service providing organizations that introduce themselves. New Americans is one of the ones that we got our workforce board. We didn't exactly know how to tap into that population very well when we wrote our last plan, but we've done amazing work with it over the years. And it's because of the partners and knowing where students are at, like adult ed centers, that's been possible. So if you guys say, well, we have limited English, proficient individuals coming all the time, that might be one of those focus populations just that's involved. And then, of course, people 45 and older, we're finding that there's a huge amount of need, right, with that area that don't have a high school diploma, and their workforce participation rates are not great either. So I also told Robert when he asked me to do this that I could get a few words in maybe about ChatGPT, because I've not been using that long overall, but it's not this big scary thing. I sat in a summit yesterday here in Kentucky with adult education providers across the state, and the speaker asked if anybody was using ChatGPT, and very few hands went up. So as educators, I know you guys might be throwing digital rocks at me that I'm talking about this, but it's really I like it because I feel like it's better than Google to get results and to get feedback. But when it comes to grant writing, the more detailed you can be in a prompt is what it's called, right? When you're asking it something. So if you said, I am a local adult education director providing services, and describe your audience. I am wanting to write a grant that does this, or is addressing this need, this question. You can get very good responses. And so just an example one here, I actually got this one from ChatGPT. Write a compelling problem statement for an adult ed grant focused on education and training for individuals limited English. You would be amazed if you copied and pasted that statement in what it will spit out. But I'll continue. Once you get the results, you can keep refining them. So this is what I like that's better than Google, because Google, you're like, do I have to add more words, or how do I don't want to get the ads. I don't want to get all this junk on here. How can I really find the result I'm looking for? And so you can, I mean, I tell it all the time, be more dynamic, give me this information, but make it more compelling. You can use words like more emotional appeal, just keep feeding it stuff back in. And if you have an account, which you can link it to your Google account, it will get to know, scaringly, right? Kind of cautiously, that where you're located and other results that you've put into it. So it can really get very specific. And that can be very, very helpful. But I would say definitely review it for the tone and consistency. And you can't always easily copy and paste the stuff into a proposal. In fact, it's going to look like one of those resumes where you might see somebody's resume and the font's all different sizes and it's spaced all weird. It'll do the same thing with ChatGPT. So you have to be careful about that. Fact check it as well. But I would say you could also use it to structure letters of support and MOUs and those partnership agreements. And then here's the really eye-opening thing. You can use it to search for grants. So it will tell you. And what I really like about it, if you used it as a research assistant, it will give you links to the sources that it's citing. And again, it doesn't have the ads. It doesn't have all those misleading search results. And so I can answer some questions about ChatGPT, but I would just say get out there and play with it, right? You would probably be amazed, but I use it as an editor. I don't try to use it really as a content creator. But if you've got, let's admit, if you're writing a grant, a lot of times you're copying and pasting from the last time you wrote that grant. So whether it's United Way or the Dollar General Literacy Foundation or things, you might just need it to refresh and get a little bit more up to date with some things. And it's great for doing that. In general, with grants, I would just say, use data as much as you can and give specific examples. Fill the space as a grant reviewer or somebody reading adult ed grants. And I used to work with our local United Way to review grants. I never appreciated just a simple response that came in and there's like a ton of space, right? Just like you guys that are teachers probably wouldn't like that if a student turned in a simple response. So try to fill the space. And then I have a misspelled word on this slide, right? And I did that on purpose. So if you have somebody proofread it, it can go a long way too, right? And that's what I would say. If you're an instructor and you're on this or watching because your boss told you to watch it and you're not really writing the grants, or somebody else at your organization does it, ask if you can, review the grants that come in, especially if you guys have those on site within your program that you're doing this work. And I had a don't slide, and I don't know why it's not showing up, but one thing I never appreciated, um, I still don't, is when a partner reaches out and wants me to write a letter of support and I don't know who they are. So make sure you know who your partners are, and think about great ways that you can support them. So
Yeah. Well, Brian, thanks. And just to everybody, you'll be getting these slides.
oh, I didn't hit the share button, did I, Robert?
That's okay.
Oh
I
my
thought you were
goodness.
going in a different
That's so
direction.
fast.
It was fine, but just to everybody in attendance, you'll be getting Brian's PowerPoint next week as we send that out. And Brian, I thought you tied it all together really, really, really nicely. And again, we're going to continue to, we'll take questions, even if we don't have time to get to them today. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll make sure we get this back to you. In fact, I've even shared with everybody that I'd like to have a part 2 with these great folks. taking this to the next level based on questions we get. And so with that, kind of tying this all together, you know, the perspective from the state level and then from our friends at Workforce and Title I, again, my former great colleague here, Ariel, who, amongst other things, really lives all this that's being talked about, just fantastic with partners, fantastic with businesses, and particularly in the IET that for many is still emerging. So with that, I'll hand it over to, again, the Adult Education Director for Collier County Public Schools in Naples, Florida. And yep.
Thank you, Robert, and appreciate being here. And I'll just give a global perspective. So as the director here for adult education in Collier County, we serve roughly 3,000 students per year in areas of English as a second language, adult basic education, GED attainment, IET programs, that's a big one. And then also, we also have a smaller program in a correctional setting. And I share this just to kind of set the stage of the different grants that we might be applying for and working towards. And regardless of the grant you're working towards, they often ask about a lot of the same pieces. And Brian and Cheryl talked about a lot of those components across the board. I know a lot of us focus on these federal grants, but it's really about what it is we want to do with these funds. We tackle it here. We look at it as a strategic plan. So we always look at it in the area of what are the areas we want to refine, enhance, grow. A big aha moment for me was that the grants weren't really intended to run my programs. They were more to support initiatives and growth in alignment what the state or the federal level is trying to accomplish. So that was an aha moment. And so in looking at it as a strategic plan, we're always looking at reflecting on the current practices we have and that we want, what are those practices that we want to continue? So focusing on those successes. What is it that we want to improve or refine? So looking at the challenges. And as we start working on those grants and even before we even you mentioned, Robert, about before we even lift that pen or start typing things out, I mentioned it before, Cheryl brought it up, you brought it up, and I'll say it again, if your program has submitted grants before, especially at federal grants, there's a rubric, and if you haven't requested it from your state office, you want to ask your state office to share with you your rubric and your results for your grants, because they will give you exactly how you scored on each of the sections, each of the questions. And that gives you a great starting point in terms of understanding what the reader's looking for, what the state's looking for, and where you might need to beef up your grants. But having said that, we're also then looking at being very clear and specific and transparent in terms of those successes and challenges that we have within our program. We don't want to assume the reader understands what we do, who we serve in our community. We try to tell the story in terms of the trends we're seeing and the challenges. Brian spoke a lot to the data and the needs. And so we bring in a lot of data into our grants. The grants often ask for it, but we bring in additional. We typically use our NRS data, previous histories, so that we can show the successes we have, the enrollment trends, the levels of the learners. We use local data to show not only the enrollment numbers and learning gains, but also if we're working towards, in IETs, we're doing a lot with certifications and students earning certifications, students transitioning to employment or advancing to higher education. So we're trying to give specifics as to what those students that are moving from one level to another or from a lower level of employment to a higher level of employment. We're trying to highlight those successes. We're also trying to paint a broader picture of our community. So Brian mentioned working closely with your workforce development board. So I use online resources a lot. Our workforce development boards have posted the WIOA combined plans. Every state has one. That gives me a nice global picture of the workforce trends, targeted groups, the role that they see as adult education that we need to be serving. IET programs, what we need to be doing with that. I then drill down to our local workforce board, because obviously North Florida looks one way, South Florida looks a whole different way. So what are those local needs? What are the in-demand industries that we have in our backyards? What are the potential employers and partners that we're working with? That makes looking at that allows me to make sure that my IET programs are still relevant. Do I need to establish new partners with new employers and to develop new IET programs because what I'm doing isn't really meeting the workforce needs? Am I closing that employment skill gap that employers in our area are talking about? Another resource I use a lot is in Florida, we have the Florida Scorecard, it's called, and it's put together by the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And that gives me a nice, at one spot, I can get a breakdown locally here for my area, my local community, of the unemployment rate, poverty rate, children receiving free and reduced lunch, the population without a high school diploma, the most critical, ages 16 to 24, and then those that are 25 plus. So all of those are data pieces that I bring in. I'll copy it, give credit to them, and insert it into my grants just to make sure that everybody knows that we're addressing a critical area, critical need. In terms of painting the picture of, telling the story of what we're going to be doing next, I try to be transparent with our need within our programs, what we plan to address, how we plan to address a particular need, and how the funds will be used. I think a great example of this is instead of saying that there are more students and therefore we need more money, which doesn't usually help, in this particular year, we're going to be sharing about how our demographics have totally shifted overnight. We used to serve predominantly a Hispanic community at intermediate levels. We are now serving a predominant Haitian community with much lower literacy levels, or coming in at lower foundational levels of language, meaning that we need to change the way we teach and the way we support this target population. So having said that, that means, what professional development am I going to be using to address the foundational skills or literacy instruction that my teachers might have? What technology resources might I be incorporating to ensure that we're really meeting the language acquisition needs? If we're talking about workforce, I know our state requires us to have IET programs. What are those IET programs? How will we be expanding those programs? Do we have partnerships with those employers so that we're meeting their needs? Do we have any MOUs with these partnering agencies so that we're to demonstrate not only the need, the partnership, and the effort going into we're all working together in a common direction. And I think the last piece I could add or share is when you're finally putting your budget together, make sure it aligns with the scope of work that you're describing. A big aha for me also is don't commit yourself or your program to work in activities that sound great on paper but are just not realistic, and it doesn't really align with your intended outcomes. Those are my little pieces.
I think those are great. Cheryl?
I just wanted to say that when you mentioned, don't assume that whoever's reading your application, even if you have you're a previous provider, you have a relationship with the state, you believe that they understand your program well. If you haven't answered the question, you should not assume that they're gonna, because if it's not articulated in your response, it's not gonna score on the rubric well. It has to be part of your response. So don't assume that they know that you're doing, this or that. And plus they may be using external readers. So then it needs to be a response that addresses what is asked, even if it feels like they should already know that. So.
And I would say acronyms go a long way to confusing the reader too, right?
Yep.
So I like to write it where I say the whole thing once and then I put the parentheses of the
Parentheses. Yeah.
acronym and then use the acronym the rest of the time, but at least I have a frame of reference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very curious to know in chat land there, would you please place in how many years have you been involved with adult education? Or if you're joining us from the workforce world or community-based organization, would you put in the chat? All you just have to do is just put if you're an attendee, how many years you've been doing this? Okay, we got some great veteran folks, some folks who may a few taking their first steps. So just some things to think about, some things that I've placed in the chat. Well, first off, we've been talking a lot about titles. And so even though so much of what you've talked about is fantastic for any grant, because we are in Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, we owe a grant season for many, with an act that just like chapters in a book, instead of calling it chapters, they call them titles, right? So sections. And so so for local directors of adult educations, typically you're filling out the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, Title II. Brian, you're Title I, I do believe, on the labor side. And something that I put in the chat was what's interesting for many as you think about collaboration between, so if Ariel and Brian, even though they're from Title II and Title I, actually, you all, though, are held to very much the same standards that we owe a common measures. Mm-hmm. So, if I could put it in layperson's terms, are we helping people, whether it's in ESL, high school equivalency, on the adult education side, IET, Brian's side, and labor, we're helping people get jobs, get the skills to keep jobs, transition to post-secondary. All of these things resonate in our objectives for the workforce side for Brian and the adult education side. So for those of you who might be relatively newer to adult ed, to know about titles, and we owe a common measures. And therefore, so if you could talk just another minute about the transition, what WIOA brought, which is wanting a lot more collaboration between in fact, that's the whole reason WIOA exists, is so that labor, vocational rehabilitation, everybody's actually talking to one another, and also with employers. So for those listening in, and by the way, if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat, but I'll turn it over to all three of you. If you want to get more discussion going and more collaboration, how do you sell it to your partners? What's in it for me? What's the Venn diagram? Because you said, Brian, if you don't mind talking about that collaboration of the GED bus you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, that was just, a statement of need at the time. We're talking about a phenomenon that was going on, but we let our workforce board know that, students were having trouble getting to our testing sites. And so, we have this issue with driver's licenses too here in Kentucky. I'm sure other states do as well, right? But it's about access, and online classes are great up until you've got to take the test. And now they got the online high school equivalency test, at least for GED. So I think some of that might have been a little bit more resolved. But being able to say that you could get a faster turnaround time, maybe going through the workforce board than writing a whole proposal and a grant and the months-long process that might take. So I would say partnering up is just making sure your local agency is doing as much as you can to partner up, because then all you have to do when it comes to the grant is explain what you already do. So if you don't have the partners, that grant's going to be it's going to be hard, and there might be some less than true statements in there about what how you say you work together if you're not working together. So that work can happen year round, and then the grants are just an easy way to summarize what you do.
Robert, you also mentioned about how do we collaborate? Well, your workforce boards, at least in our area, they have quarterly meetings, and we're sitting at the table with them. We're talking about trends we're seeing. We're talking about challenges we're seeing, and it's really a two-way street. They have an audience that really would be served greatly by adult education, and then adult education has an audience that would be served tremendously by them to get them employed, to have resources paid for them, to have them paid for their GED programs. And so really we want to get them in front of employers ultimately.
And Ariel, what about the healthcare like for certificated areas. And again, when I got into adult education, it was just come learn English, get your high school equivalency, and that was it. But whether it's
a nurse is not just a nurse. In most countries it might be, but here when we come to the United States, we've got different levels of nurses in nursing. And so really trying to help students understand that. And so we're in working with IET programs, we've started a lot of intro courses, intro IETs that help students at a lower level explore the different pathways. And then from there, they'll transition on to post-secondary at a higher level, but already now have a purpose, a direction, a stronger foundation. For those students coming in that might be struggling or might not have the time or might not be at the level to be successful in a post-secondary institution, we've already started, even in adult ed, teaching nursing assistant and helping them get certified and working closer with the Workforce Development Board to get them hired, or working closely with our local hospital to get them get a foot through the door.
And Brian, if I'm on the adult education side, back in your past life, what kind of resources as far as data and stating my case to make an even more compelling case for my Title II grant? What kind of data or assistance might I be able to get from my Title I, my American Job Centers or Workforce Investment Board?
Yeah, so I gave some data to one of our local directors. We have 3 agencies that serve our region, and it was my former place, right, stomping grounds. But we always had a lot of limited English proficient individuals, and so our ESL programs could be huge. Our GED, not as much. And so I feel like I had to articulate the data supports why these ESL students are coming, because there are so many of them, and it's not. ESL is not preschool. It is not kindergarten, right? It is grade level equivalency work going on. It's very important. So to be able to articulate that, hopefully you don't have to do that in your state grant, but in any other grants where you're seeking that kind of instructional, the powerhouse that it is. I mean, really being able to support that with the data, and like Ariel said, with the influx that's coming in, there's offices that can provide that information. But again, Chat GPT could, but sometimes the American Community Survey information is behind the times. So there can be, arrival numbers. If it's refugees and things like that, you should be able to get from a state office or even more regional, local office to give you that kind of information. But the trend keeps going up. Like immigration, I mean, I'm just picking on that one for a minute, but incarceration is another one. There's a lot of data that's out there, the impact of incarceration on unemployment rates and all of that sort of thing. So correctional instruction, there's tons of data that will be supportive for you.
Just wanted to add from the state perspective as far as the alignment with workforce. So I mentioned that the workforce has to have the opportunity to not evaluate, but to review and provide comment on alignment. In Arizona, we took those comments, and even if so say the alignment was poor, but the rest of the grant application, it scored at a funding level, that gave us information as far as how to work, or maybe some additional requirements to make, like you get the funding, but you have to improve in this area, kind of thing. So some of the application points might result in additional technical assistance as you're implementing the award.
Wonderful. Well, friends, we've reached the top of the hour. I know I've learned so much. Cannot take enough time to say thank you to all those who listened in, participated today. Once again, please next week check out for a recording of this webinar, and please direct anybody who wasn't able, maybe in your sphere, to attend. Also, we've got resources coming from our presenters to you next week as well on so many of the things that were touched on, and be looking for that email again. So again, for Robert Breitbart, Director of Educational Partnerships for Burlington English, cannot say enough kind words and thank you to Cheryl Hart, Brian Becker, and Ariel Pachokas. All right, friends.
Thank you, Robert.
Hope it's a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you on a future webinar. Thank you, everyone.